Hello again, YouTube. This is a review of Mad Max Fury Road. Now, for those of you who are cringing and thinking, uh-oh, this is going to be yet another movie review by Peter, where he complains about a movie he saw in the theater and didn't like, and now he's going to rant about it, and doesn't he like any movie ever? I'm going to state right up front, fear not, I liked this movie. And I think that many other movies could really learn from what this movie does right. The Mad Max franchise is something I'm fairly familiar with, having seen the other Mad Max movies at various points in the past, particularly the second and third movie, The Road Warrior and Beyond Thunderdome. A few years ago, I had a roommate, Sam, and she, I wouldn't necessarily say was obsessed with these movies, but she would watch them repeatedly. Like, I don't know how many times she watched The Road Warrior and Beyond Thunderdome, but it seemed like it was, at least once a week she would watch these movies, and I'd be walking through the living room or hanging out, and she'd be watching the movies. And so, in a non-linear sense, I've seen those movies many times. So when I heard that they were making one, a new Mad Max movie, and I saw the trailer, I said, this looks really cool. And I heard that the original director had returned, the writer and director, and that it wasn't just a reboot, that it was more or less a sequel, although there doesn't seem to be any real continuity between the movies. And the fact that they're mostly relying on practical effects and it's not all just a bunch of CGI. All of that combined to make me think this has a shot at actually being a decent movie. But of course, I'm cynical and I've come to expect the worst when it comes to movies, and everything just seems to be one long train of disappointment after disappointment. So I didn't really get my hopes up. But then, once the movie was released, I started seeing lots of positive reviews. Half in the Bag liked the movie. Lots of other reviews that I saw, they said it was a great movie. Articles, a lot of buzz. It got like a 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, of course, the world being a cruel and unjust place, it was beaten at the box office by Pitch Perfect 2. Almost everyone who sees this seems to love it. So I saw it the second week that it was in theaters. Going in, again, it's like, don't want to get your hopes up. The trailer looked cool. It has all this potential. All these people on the internet are saying that it's great, but I'm still trying not to get my hopes up. But no, I loved it. I'm just gonna join the choir of people who think this movie's great. And let me state, before I go into any more explanations, that the primary reason why I enjoyed this movie, it's going to sound basic, and it's going to sound like Screenwriting 101, and it's going to sound like no shit, but in light of so many other Hollywood movies that I've seen, in light of my ever-increasing age and ever-increasing cynicism, this simple feat that this movie performs seems like a miracle in comparison to so many other movies that I've seen recently. Okay, so this movie made me care enough about the characters to be emotionally invested, to care whether or not they were going to survive, to care whether or not they were going to achieve their goals. And because I cared, I felt, anticipation, anxiety, exhilaration, excitement, all these other emotions that come with being emotionally invested in the characters. And so, yes, this movie was a spectacle. Yes, this movie has great music that's well integrated into both the feel of the movie and, the editing. It's a visual and auditory spectacle, but it's also an emotional roller coaster. And it just seems like so few movies achieve that nowadays. Relatively recently, I made a video about the Avengers, and my primary complaint with that movie is that although it was fairly entertaining, so much of it was just like, oh, okay, it's this big CGI spectacle that I don't really feel any great sense of stake in, and, cut to shot of Captain America destroying a bunch of generic robots, cut to Thor killing a bunch of generic robots, cut to this character killing a bunch of generic robots, cutting really quickly to all this CGI action with no real sense of stakes. And yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, the characters in the Avengers are cool and witty, and, you know, it's got snappy dialogue and all that, whereas Mad Max, you know, barely has dialogue. But there was no doubt that the characters are going to, you know, that the heroes are going to succeed in the end and that they're going to kill all these generic robots. So there's no sense of stakes, really. The Avengers Age of Ultron was entertaining to a point, but it didn't really provide the fulfillment of a movie that can pull you in on that emotional level of where you're really, you know, you have that sense of anticipation and excitement and anxiety over what's going to happen when you're invested at that level. When a movie can hook you at that level, then it goes beyond the mere spectacle that so many other action movies are nowadays. It seems really simple. It seems like screenwriting 101. Make the audience care about your characters so that they care about them achieving their goals, and when you put the characters in peril, the audience is on the edge of their seat, and if you can make the audience emotionally invested, then take that journey with that character. But so many movies just don't achieve that, and instead they rely on spectacle and how much things they can make blow up, and don't achieve that emotional connection with the audience. Mad Max Fury Road is really a movie that focuses on delivering at what cinema is good at. As to the actual plot of the movie, like all of the Mad Max films, it takes place in a post-apocalyptic future in an area called the Wasteland. There's been nuclear war, there's been resource depletion, and in this movie, you have warlords controlling the population of the Wasteland through control of natural resources. The primary antagonist of this movie, Immortan Joe, controls an area called the Citadel, which has water and food. And there are other towns that have fuel and bullets. And in this movie, Charlize Theron plays a character called Furiosa, who is an Imperator of Immortan Joe, who is sent out on a war rig, which is basically a tractor-trailer, to trade with the other towns that have fuel and bullets. Trade their food and breast milk, as strange as that sounds, for their resources of gasoline and bullets. And along the way, as she's driving to these towns, she takes a 90-degree turn off the road and starts driving out into the wasteland. And as it turns out, she is in the process of liberating Immortan Joe's sex slaves. And she is going to take them to an area, I believe they call it the wetlands, which she remembers from her childhood. As it turns out later in the movie, she was basically taken from this area as a child, and so she has childhood memories of it, and she's taking these women back there. And once Immortan Joe discovers that Furiosa has absconded with his wives, he gets his war party together to chase after them, and the people from Bullet Town and the Gasoline Town, or Guzzolene, they all go chasing after Furiosa. There's other groups in the desert that also attempt to attack them as a sort of target of opportunity. Mad Max gets thrown in the mix. Now, certain people seem confused by the fact that Tom Hardy is really, at best, the co-lead of this movie, if not sort of the supporting character to Charlize Theron. Some people apparently felt deceived by this, but I don't know what to tell you. They put her face and her name right there on the poster, right next to Tom Hardy. So it's pretty clear from the poster that she's the co-lead. And Mad Max really it's more of the franchise name, and it tells you less about the plot and just more indicates the franchise and the world that it takes place in. So this movie is really built around a chase. There's a subplot about a war boy named Nux. And one of the more interesting things about this movie is really the world that it's built in. Aside from the really over-the-top characters and the really amazing design, it takes place in a really cool world that's just sort of fascinating and evocative, even if you don't know a lot about the backstories of every character. So this character, Immortan Joe, is more than just a tyrant or a dictator who rules over these people by controlling natural resources. He's a kind of cult leader, essentially. And there's a group called the War Boys who do his bidding. They worship him, essentially. They've been fed all of this belief system that's much like the Vikings, that they're gonna, if they sacrifice themselves and die in combat, they're gonna go to Valhalla. And so all of these war boys are completely willing to fight and die for Immortan Joe. And this character Nux has a story arc as he goes chasing after Furiosa. This character Nux has a very interesting character arc to where you come to have empathy for this character. Max, who, his name's in the title of the movie, plays somewhat less of a role than you might imagine. He spends perhaps the first quarter of the movie essentially as a prisoner, and when he does become involved with Furiosa and that part of the story, he at first has no interest whatsoever in helping anybody but himself. He's just trying to get away. And throughout the movie, he becomes more invested in the other characters and not just turning his back. So he has an interesting character arc. You start to learn more about Furiosa and what sort of person she is and what makes her tick. And a lot of this movie, it doesn't rely on dialogue. The dialogue is incredibly sparse. And because many of the characters are in cars, you see a lot of close-ups, and a lot of the expression of the characters is in the face. And this is Charlize Theron was great in this movie, and I think a lot of it is because of the subtleties of her facial expression. That's one thing that I've noticed over the years, or relatively recently, is that I've started to cue in much more acutely to like the little subtle things about the facial expressions of actors and how well they accomplish that. Kristen Stewart is one of those actresses who's notorious for not being able to emote, and she only seems to have one sort of facial expression, and so she gets panned for that. A lot of Charlize Theron's performance is really in her face and the nuances of her expression, and she does it quite well. And Max seems to grunt a lot in this movie. I don't know how many of you have seen Boardwalk Empire, but the character Richard Harrow, he has this very distinct way of speaking because he had half of his face blown off in World War I, and so he sort of grunts and speaks in this very distinct way. And every time, or most of the time, that Max speaks in this movie, it reminded me of Richard Harrow from Boardwalk Empire. But really, as a lot of people have said in other reviews, the character of Furiosa, played by Charlize Theron, really steals the show in this movie. Charlize Theron is able to portray a lot of depth and complexity to the character, even though the character doesn't say much. And I would say that also for Tom Hardy, but far more so for Furiosa. That's what's great about this movie, is that without saying a lot, there's not a bunch of Tarantino-esque dialogue scenes where people sit around drinking coffee and talking about Madonna's Like a Virgin. It's not a dialogue movie like that. It's a subtlety of the actor's performance kind of movie. So you really, it's almost something you have to see to understand. But it doesn't feel shallow. It doesn't feel like generic action stars blowing shit up like so many other movies. There's a very human dimension to it. Again, I think this is part of what makes the movie work, but it's difficult to describe. But through the characterization and through the performances and the story arcs of the characters, you gradually become invested in these characters, so that when the moment comes when everything's at stake and the big climax in the movie comes, at least my experience was, and of course your mileage may vary, as they say, I actually cared. I was, invested in these characters. I was, on the edge of my seat of what's going to happen when things did happen. I had an emotional reaction. It's sort of sad to say that that's fairly rare in cinema nowadays, to be emotionally engaged by a movie. So many movies focus on spectacle and don't deliver on that emotional investment in the movie. And this movie delivers on the spectacle. Not only does it use practical effects, but the action sequences, you can understand what's going on. It's not this, if we disorient you enough, you'll think things are happening and it's really cool Michael Bay philosophy of action movies that so many others. I mean, you can see and comprehend what's going on, and it's exciting and spectacular, but it's not attempting to disorient you like shitty action movies do nowadays. You can comprehend what's going on. It's visually spectacular. The whole movie looks great. The music is great and fits well with the movie and the editing. It has those elements of spectacle that other action movies have. It does it better than many other action movies because it doesn't fall into that disorientation equals excitement trap. But it also has, the emotional dimension that, gets you invested and gives you a sense of satisfaction that many other movies nowadays simply don't deliver. I honestly think this is probably one of my all-time favorite action movies. I would recommend this movie unless you just really hate action movies. Basically, this movie is fun, entertaining, visually spectacular, and emotionally engaging. So if that doesn't make you want to see it, then, well, what the fuck movies do you like? Have a nice whatever time it is. Goodbye.